My name is Mitali Nikor, and I'm the founder of Nikor Associates. Nikor Associates is a think tank, a research organization, a youth led group. And our aim is to constantly question policies, schemes, government actions, private sector actions, and ensure that there is gender mainstreaming in all of these actions. Today, I'm so thankful to found it and to this initiative of Triumph by Found It, because they have started this series of discussions and dialogues around addressing systematic inequalities and biases. And I'm very glad to be able to talk about my views on addressing systematic inequalities and biases. Particularly, I want to focus on gender inequalities in my discussion today. So what are the ways in which gender inequalities are manifesting in India is something I want to, raise in front of all of you. As you may already have heard, because this is something that it's becoming very normal in the mainstream media to report now. India has amongst one of the lowest female labor force participation rates in the world. But how did we get here? Because in 1978 to 1980 and even towards the late 80s, the female labor force participation rates were much higher. In fact, in 1987-88, the FLFPR was approximately 43-44%. But if we look at the latest data in 2021-22, it's about 33%. So about a third of women today are in the labor force. They are either looking for work or they are working. And most of these working women are in rural areas, and they are mostly working in agriculture sector. So what is happening around us, and what is it that has led to this overall decline in women's labor force participation? I feel that this is rooted in systemic biases. The first systemic bias which has led to this is around gender stereotypes and social norms. The fact that women continue to be looked at as primary caregivers and are often asked to sacrifice their careers in favor of domestic caregiving responsibilities, or are often looked at as supplementary or secondary income earners, that yes, when the household income is actually high enough, they don't need to work. This kind of systemic bias prevents them from actually progressing in their careers, even and this systemic bias, which is of course a societal bias, but it comes into workplaces as well, because systemic biases and social biases are one and the same thing. Our workplaces are actually situated in a society which holds these biases. So this is the first manifestation. The second manifestation of systemic biases is around occupational segregation. There are some jobs that are considered, suitable for women, and some which are not. And this happens in pretty much every sector. So if we look at agriculture, the fact that women make up the majority of the labor force in agriculture, the wage related workers, the ones who are doing the most back-breaking work, that has over the years emerged as women's work. And whenever you bring in a new technology, a new machine, a new innovation, even in agriculture, that suddenly displaces women's work. And in fact, this was one of the major reasons for the falling labor force participation in the last few decades, especially in rural areas. The fact that women's work was displaced by men operating more advanced machinery. So, this occupational segregation is another example of a systemic bias. And it also exists in urban areas, because if we think about it, the systemic bias manifests in terms of more women being occupied and, working in sectors like education, health, in certain job roles like teaching or nursing, but not in others like being doctors or being, the owners of educational institutions for that matter. So, that occupational segregation, as I was mentioning, and the systemic bias that it arises because of happens in every sector. Even in sectors like textiles, those are the sectors in which women are sitting in their houses and actually weaving, doing that hard labor of actually producing a lot of the textiles, garments, saris, all this beautiful embroidery work, and the stitching work that you see. Women are doing it, in fact, sometimes in their homes. But the task of collecting it, aggregating it, and taking it to a consumption center becomes a male activity. So this systemic bias actually prevents women, and specifically women entrepreneurs, from coming in contact with their final customers, and constrains their labor force participation. So the first one, as we talked about, is social norms, particularly around unpaid work. The second one is occupational segregation, which manifests in various ways. Now, a third way of which we are seeing much more now is around mobility restrictions. Asking women, where are you going? What time are you going to come back? When are you going to be, back to the house? Who are you going with? What is the purpose? These mobility restrictions are all around us. And they are also a manifestation of systemic biases, because the entire urban mobility and urban transport sector, is actually not adopting a gender lens. Most of the designing is done by men for an average neutral male user, but it often overlooks the needs of women consumers and women commuters, which may be, manifesting in the form of maybe wanting more services during the off-peak hours, or maybe wanting, connectivity between two areas which are not the same as, connecting the residential areas with the office districts, which is what typically public transport systems do. And overall, even the lack of safety on public transport and in public spaces, and the low presence of women in public spaces further contributing to that lack of safety. These are all examples of systemic bias, and these actually restrict women's choices when it comes to the labor market. And how many women do you know? I'm sure you know many who have said, no, no, I'll take this job because the office is near my house. That automatically means the system is creating a barrier for them to choose a job that they may want, but they then don't choose it because they say, oh no, it's too far away, and I have to commute to my workplace on a daily basis, and I simply cannot use this transport system, or it's not affordable for me. So, the system is then creating these barriers for women's labor force participation, particularly through mobility. So, that's our third manifestation of systemic bias I want to point out. The fourth manifestation of systemic bias I would like to focus on is the gender digital divide. The fact that you have a lower likelihood that women will own a smartphone, a lower likelihood that women-owned businesses will be found to be digitally, present, and to be transacting digitally through digital payments, or on digital e-commerce sites, or any sort of digital marketing means, creates a situation where, though you might have, theoretically equal access to the internet or to, mobile based data, in reality there are gendered implications to their use. And that's also a manifestation of systemic bias. The last one, fifth systemic bias I'd like to talk about, is around the organized urban corporate sector. So, as I mentioned, the largest group of women today who are working are actually working in agriculture as rural wage laborers. But the second largest group of women is in the services sector, who are postgraduate women working in urban areas in the services sector, which is pretty much, your manifestation of the corporate sector. And these women, they have aspirations, they want to be leaders in their field, but at every step they face a manifestation of this systemic bias. It could be that they are being asked to work late hours. It could be that they are excluded from decision making. It could be that they are excluded from, new projects. It could be that because of maternity, they are not able to access the maternity leave to which they are entitled. It could be that, they are being pressured not to take their maternity leave. And also because of the lack of recognition that, care work is a gender neutral activity, companies don't have any care work leave provisions for both men and women, and the expectation is that women will continue to do, both activities of homework and outside work, in a sense, exhausting themselves on both sides, whereas men don't take up that responsibility at home, and neither are there any provisions in, our workplace laws or norms or regulations or guidelines from the private sector or from the government to say to men that yes, you should also be performing care work at home. And other than that, of course, there are biases, unconscious biases that are operational within the corporate sector leadership, and characterizing a woman who is just strong as over aggressive. These are all manifestations of unconscious bias, which then, together, coming together at the aggregate level, lead to a systemic bias. So these manifestations of systemic bias, be it the unpaid care work responsibility and looking at women as the primary caregivers, be it the lack of systems in the corporate sector particularly to address and set an example, these manifestations actually lead to systemic bias at a very, very large aggregate level. So then the question becomes, now that we know that these systemic biases exist and that they manifest in the form of gender divides when it comes to unpaid work, when it comes to digital literacy and digital access, when it comes to accessing marketplaces, accessing finance, accessing the same jobs, uh, mobility restrictions, how do we correct for these biases? So I think the first step is really the recognition, which, if you're listening to this video, at least you would have some, grasp of that recognition. But then the second step in that recognition is quantification. If we don't collect gender disaggregated data, if we don't collect data on how women's lives are and how they what their requirements from public services are, what their requirements from employers are, if we don't speak to women and allow them to be spoken to, then we would not be able to create gender responsive systems that actually address these biases directly. So I think there is a need to collect a lot more gender disaggregated data and then analyze it. The other aspect, the other big area in which, we can correct these systematic biases is by increasing diversity in decision making and representation. I know you might all be quite tired of listening to this, that, we need more women in leadership and we need more women in decision making, but we do. And I have seen this personally that, whenever I have worked with clients where there's a woman in the decision making, she will always say, let's have a, gender lens on this study, or let's have a gender lens on this system. Men may also say it, especially when they are sensitized, but a woman will always say it. And that's the big difference, the fact that you have this woman on the other side, and she is making that happen. So women being in the decision making and in leadership roles sets out that role model, the example for the next generation, and for even in the peer generation, somebody who might be coming from a different set of social norms and may not be aware or exposed to this set of social norms, which allow for greater mobility and equality for women. So, all in all, if we can have systems that recognize the gender biases which are systemic in nature, quantify them, and then have women in decision making that can take those decisions to correct them, and to take intentional actions to correct them. Of course, it's not enough to have women in those roles. It's also important that the women in those roles take those intentional actions to actually correct for those biases. So, with that entire process of recognition, quantification, and then intentional actions for correction, especially with women's leadership, we can actually address some of these systemic biases. Thank you.